King George III of the United Kingdom reigned as king from the 20th of October 1760 to the 29th of January 1820. His marriage to Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz resulted in 15 children, all of whom survived birth. This video will dive into the lives of 4 of his 9 sons: King George IV, Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, King William IV, and Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn. George IV was born in St. James's Palace in London on the 12th of August 1762. He was the eldest child of George III and his wife Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. He had 14 siblings. As the eldest son of the king, George was given the title of Prince of Wales a few days after his birth. He was academically gifted and had a knack for languages. He learned to speak French, German and Italian fluently alongside his native English. When he turned 18, George was given a separate estate to live in and threw himself into scandal very quickly. He loved to drink and loved women. His love for extravagance put him at odds with his father and mother, who lived generally scandal-free. Soon, George fell in love with Maria Fitzherbert, a widowed Catholic commoner, 6 years older than him. Because of the Act of Settlement 1701 and the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, he was unable to marry her by law due to her being a Catholic and not obtaining the king's consent. Despite this, the couple married in a secret ceremony in 1785. However, this marriage was null and void as the king's consent had not been sought nor given. Even though he had a large annual income, it was not enough to cover his living expenses. George's father refused to help him, and George had to move into Maria's home. The political allies of the prince helped him to obtain a huge grant from Parliament, which paid for his debts and home improvements. In 1788, George III's mental health deteriorated and he was unable to carry out his duties. Parliament was suspended for a period of 2 months, and when Parliament reconvened, the king was unable to open Parliament. As such, Parliament passed the Regency Bill, which allowed the Prince of Wales to act as a regent on behalf of his father. However, by this point the king had recovered and the Prince of Wales did not need to become regent. As George's debts grew, his father offered him an ultimatum: marry Princess Caroline of Brunswick and his debts would be paid. The prince agreed, and on the 8th of April 1795, George and Caroline were wed. Because George's marriage to Maria Fitzherbert was not considered legal, George was able to marry Caroline. The marriage was unhappy and the couple were not compatible. However, they did their duty and their only child, Princess Charlotte, was born in 1796. After the birth of their daughter, the couple remained separated and George continued to liaise with his various mistresses and Maria Fitzherbert. George was rumoured to have had several illegitimate children, including James Ord, who was a Jesuit priest, Captain Henry A.F. Hervey, Major George Seymour Crowell, William Hampshire, and Charles Bow Candy. However, he never explicitly claimed them as his children, so it's only speculation. In 1804, George and Caroline fought over the custody of their daughter. This dispute led to an inquiry being made into Princess Caroline's conduct after George accused her of adultery, resulting in the birth of an illegitimate son. Their daughter was eventually placed in the care of George III and Caroline was cleared of the charge. In 1810, George's youngest sister Amelia died, and it broke his father. George III never recovered from the death of his beloved daughter and his mental health deteriorated. He would be incapacitated for the rest of his life. Parliament granted a new bill, the Regency Act of 1811, which named George as the Prince Regent. He was effectively king in all but name. George let his ministers do as they pleased in government and took on a smaller role than his father had. He established the principle of the Prime Minister being the person that was supported by the majority of Parliament, even if the monarch disagreed with the choice. It was expected that George would support the Whigs in their pursuit of Catholic emancipation, but he chose not to. In 1812, the Prime Minister Perceval was assassinated and Lord Liverpool was appointed as Prime Minister. In 1814, the electorate of Hanover was raised to a kingdom, and the war in continental Europe against Napoleon I, the French Emperor, ended in a French defeat. In 1817, Princess Charlotte died after giving birth to a stillborn son. The death of his only legitimate child would haunt George for the rest of his life, and would throw the succession into crisis. Charlotte was the only legitimate grandchild of George III, and her death prompted the unmarried sons of George III to marry and try to produce a child. During his reign as the Prince Regent, George popularised a new style of clothing and housing, became known as the Regency style. In 1820, George III died, and George, the Prince Regent, ascended the throne as George IV. By this point, George was obese and addicted to laudanum. George refused to recognise his estranged wife as queen, and he refused her entry for his coronation on the 19th of July, 1821. He sought a divorce, but decided to not go forward with the divorce as his various adulterous relationships might have come to light. On the 7th of August, 1821, Caroline died. George's coronation was extravagant and cost a whopping £23 million in today's currency. For the first time since Richard II, George visited Ireland in 1821, followed by Scotland. George IV spent much of his reign in Windsor Castle. In 1827, the Prime Minister retired and George Canning became the Prime Minister. The question of the Catholic emancipation was one of the biggest dilemmas to face George IV. He was anti-Catholic. Canning died in 1827, and Lord Goderic, followed by the Duke of Wellington, both became Prime Ministers that year and the following year. Wellington knew that the emancipation would happen eventually, and a Catholic relief bill was passed in 1829. However, it was not without controversy. Despite giving consent for the bill, under pressure from his anti-Catholic brother Ernest Augustus, the Duke of Cumberland, the king withdrew his approval and cabinet resigned in protest. Under intense political pressure, the king eventually agreed to the bill and cabinet were given back their positions. George was a heavy drinker and eater, and at one point he weighed 20 stone. Later in life he developed gout, arteriosclerosis, dropsy and porphyria. In his final years he spent many days in bed and had difficulty breathing. To help with his pain, the king took laudanum, developing an addiction that left him in a mentally impaired state. By the end of his life, he had lost sight in one eye and was confined to bed. However, his appetite for food remained till the very end. During the early hours of the 26th of June, 1830, George IV passed away from upper gastrointestinal bleeding. Prince Frederick, Duke of York and Albany, was born on the 16th of August 1763 at St. James's Palace. He was the second child of King George III and Queen Charlotte. He was 6 months old when his father elected him as Prince Bishop of Osnabrück in Lower Saxony. The bishopric of Osnabrück was ruled alternately by a Catholic bishop and a Protestant bishop from the Duchy of Brunswick-Luneburg. As Frederick's father was also the Elector of Hanover, he got to choose who would be the bishopric. Frederick was created a Knight of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath in 1767 and a Knight of the Garter in 1771. Frederick was brought up and educated with his elder brother at Kew Palace. Robert Darcy, the 4th Earl of Holderness, was their governor, and William Markham, Bishop of Chester, was their chief tutor. After Markham became the Archbishop of York, Richard Hurd, Bishop of Worcester, became their chief tutor. princes spent 8 hours a day with their tutors and learned to ride and fence. In 1780, it was decided that Frederick would serve in the army, and he was made a colonel. Frederick was sent off to Hanover for military training under the supervision of Lieutenant Colonel Robert Fulk Greville. From 1781 to 1787, Frederick lived in Hanover, where he participated in manoeuvres and attended the University of Göttingen with his brothers Edward, Ernest, Augustus, and Adolphus. By 1784, Frederick reached the rank of colonel. On the 27th of November 1784, Frederick was created Duke of York and Albany and Earl of Ulster, and became a member of the Privy Council. In 1787, upon his return to England, Frederick took a seat in the House of Lords. When his father's mental health deteriorated and the Regency Bill was proposed, Frederick strongly opposed it. Frederick married Princess Frederica Charlotte of Prussia on the 29th of September 1791 in the Charlottenburg Palace. A second wedding ceremony was held in Buckingham Palace on the 23rd of November 1791. The marriage was unsuccessful. Frederick was unfaithful and the couple were unable to have children. In 1794, the couple separated but remained on friendly terms and never caused any scandals together. In 1793, Frederick was promoted to full general. That year, the Flanders Campaign began and lasted until 1793. It was a coalition of military forces along the French borders, with the goal to invade France and stop Napoleon's First French Republic. Frederick was commander of the British forces, and after many successes and defeats, Frederick was recalled to England in 1795. Eventually, the coalition was forced to withdraw. A well-known nursery rhyme was inspired for Frederick's defeat at the Battle of Turcoing. In 1795, Frederick was promoted to Field Marshal and Commander-in-Chief of the forces of Great Britain and Ireland. He instituted a number of reforms in the British Army, and in 1801 he founded the Royal Military College in Sandhurst for training infantry and cavalry officers. He was also in charge of the preparations against Napoleon's planned invasion of the United Kingdom in 1803. Frederick's many reforms enabled the British Army to be stronger than ever before, and this proved helpful in the Peninsular War, which finally defeated Napoleon. In 1803, Frederick began an affair with Mary Ann Clark. In 1809, the charges were brought against Frederick in the House of Commons by Gwilym Wardle. These charges claimed that Frederick allowed Clark to influence him in the granting of commissions in the British Army. This caused a national scandal when Clark testified that she had sold army commissions with Frederick's knowledge. Frederick was acquitted of any implications, but resigned anyway as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army. In 1811, George III was deemed unfit to reign, so Frederick's older brother George reigned as Prince Regent until their father's death. George reappointed Frederick as Commander-in-Chief on the 29th of May 1811. From then on, Frederick exercised strict impartiality with officer commissions and promotions. In 1817, Princess Charlotte of Wales, Frederick's only living legitimate niece, died after delivering a stillborn son. This caused a succession crisis. Despite the fact that George III had 15 children, and 12 of them were still alive by this point, only one, George, had produced a legitimate child, Princess Charlotte of Wales. Unless Frederick's brother had another child, Frederick would be heir presumptive upon his father's death. Frederick's unmarried brothers rushed to find brides, but any children born to them would be behind Frederick in the line of succession. In 1819, Frederick was entrusted with the care of his father, who by this point was blind, deaf, and suffering from dementia. King George III died on the 29th of January 1820, and Frederick's brother became King George IV. Frederick's wife died on the 6th of August 1820, and Frederick never remarried. On the 5th of January 1827, Frederick passed away at the age of 63. William IV was born on the 21st of August 1765 at Buckingham House as the third child of King George III and Queen Charlotte. At this point he had two older brothers, George and Frederick. William was never expected to inherit the throne. He had 12 younger siblings. Educated by private tutors as a child, once he turned 13 he joined the Royal Navy as a midshipman. His experiences in the Navy were not much different from any other midshipman, although he did have a tutor on board. During the American War of Independence, William served in New York. In 1785 he became a lieutenant and the following year a captain. That year he was stationed in the West Indies. William wanted to be created a duke like his brothers, but his father was reluctant to allow this. William threatened to stand for the House of Commons, and his father created him Duke of Clarence and St Andrews and Earl of Munster to stop this. William ceased active service in the Navy in 1790, and when Britain declared war on France in 1793, he was eager to serve. He expected to be given a position of command, but that was not to be, as he had broken his arm falling down some stairs and gave a speech in the House of Commons opposing the war. William never held a position of command throughout the Napoleonic Wars. The closest he came to actual fighting was in 1813 when, watching the bombardment of Antwerp, he came under fire and a bullet lodged itself in his coat. After the Navy, William spent time in the House of Lords. He opposed the abolition of slavery and was racist and xenophobic, especially towards French people. From 1791, William had a sexual and romantic relationship with an actress called Dorothea Jordan. They lived together and had 10 children. As they were not married, none of William's children were eligible in the line of succession. In 1797, William was given the position of Ranger of Bushy Park, which included a large house, large enough to accommodate his growing family. Between 1825 and 1827, William had Clarence House built. William and Dorothea's relationship ended in 1811. She was given a financial allowance every year and custody of their daughters on the condition that she never act again. However, Dorothea resumed acting in order to pay one of her daughter's husband's enormous debt. William discovered this and took custody of their daughters and stopped paying Dorothea. Dorothea's career began to fail, and to escape her creditors, she fled to France, where she died in 1816 in poverty. William also had one illegitimate son before his relationship with Dorothea. His name was William, and he drowned off Madagascar in 1807. Deep in debt, William attempted to marry a wealthy heiress, but was unsuccessful. In 1817, William's niece, Princess Charlotte of Wales, the second in line to the British throne and only legitimate grandchild of George III, died. It seemed more likely as time went on that William would eventually become king and he would need an heir. In 1818, William married the young Princess Adelaide of Saxe-Meiningen, and though they were married for almost 20 years, they had no surviving children together. For the first year of their marriage, they lived in Germany, as it was much cheaper than Britain. Their marriage was a happy one, and William is not known to have had any extramarital affairs. In 1820, George III died, and William's eldest brother, the Prince of Wales and Prince Regent since 1811, became King George IV. In 1827, William's next oldest brother, Frederick, died, and William became heir presumptive. He was much healthier than George, and it seemed like only a matter of time before William would be king. The Prime Minister, George Canning, appointed William to the office of Lord High Admiral. William had arguments with the Admiral Council, and it came to a head when in 1828 William put a squadron of ships to sea without a word of where they were going. The king ordered that he resign from his position. William did as he was told. During this time, as Lord High Admiral, he abolished the Cat o' Nine Tails for most offences aside from mutiny, improved the standard of naval gunnery, and established regular reports on the condition and preparedness of each ship. He also commissioned the first steam warship. On the 26th of June 1830, George IV died, and William became King William IV. Unlike his brother, William lived in London for most of his reign and was very popular. He was not afraid to ask questions if it was necessary, and he was down to earth and much more approachable than previous kings had been. He did not have an indulgent appetite and gave much of his brother George's art collection to the nation. William tried to give Buckingham Palace away twice, but was turned down in both instances. Upon taking the throne, William created his children the titles of a child of a Marquess and his eldest son the Earl of Munster. When William came to the throne, the reform crisis was in full swing. In the election of 1830, Wellington was defeated in the House of Commons and Lord Grey replaced him as Prime Minister. Very little had changed in the electoral system since the 1400s. Many large towns had no elected members of Parliament, while small boroughs had many elected members of Parliament, which was highly unfair and undemocratic. The first Reform Bill was defeated in the House of Commons in 1831, and the Prime Minister urged William to dissolve Parliament. William was hesitant to do so, as Parliament had only just been elected the previous year. However, he was also irritated by the conduct of the opposition, and so William went to the House of Commons and dissolved Parliament. New elections were held and the bill passed through the House of Commons. However, it stalled in the House of Lords. The King's coronation occurred on the 8th of September 1831. It was not as extravagant as his brother's had been. He spent only £16,000 compared to his brother spent £240,000 on his coronation. William would have preferred to have not had a coronation at all, but not given much of a say in the matter. The second Reform Bill also failed to pass through the House of Lords. Grey suggested that William create more peers to ensure that the bill passed, but William refused. He had already created over 20 new peers in his coronation honours. However, he eventually and reluctantly agreed and created new titles for the eldest sons of peers already in the House of Lords, so that the titles would eventually be absorbed as subsidiary titles. The bill was not rejected outright, but the Lords began to change parts of the bill. When Grey and his fellow ministers threatened to resign if the king did not create a large enough amount of peers to force the bill, William accepted the resignation. The 1832 Reform Act eventually passed. William was also King of Hanover and ruled from London. There was a common misconception at the time that Britain dictated Hanoverian policy, but this was not true. In 1833, William signed a new constitution for Hanover, which empowered the middle class, gave some power to the poor, and expanded the role of Parliament. However, much of this would be revoked by his successor and brother, Ernest Augustus. William and his wife Adelaide were fond of William's niece Alexandrina Victoria of Kent, or more commonly referred to Victoria. They attempted to forge a close relationship with her, but were thwarted by the Duchess of Kent, Victoria's mother. The king thought the Duchess was disrespectful towards him, and at his final birthday banquet in August 1836, he expressed his hope aloud to everyone present that he hoped he would live until Victoria turned 18, so that the Duchess would never be regent. Victoria and the Duchess were so shocked that Victoria burst into tears and the Duchess sat in silence for the rest of the meal. William's eldest daughter, Sophia, Lady de Lisle and Dudley, died in childbirth in April 1837, and it shook William. 2 months later, on the 20th of June 1837, William passed away. His niece Victoria of Kent became Queen Victoria of the United Kingdom, while William's younger brother Ernest Augustus became King of Hanover. Prince Edward, Duke of Kent and Strathearn, was born on the 2nd of November 1767, the fourth son and fifth child of the 15 children of King George III and Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz. Edward was first educated at home by the Reverend John Fisher before he was educated in Limburg, Hanover and Switzerland. In 1785, Edward began his military training with the Hanoverian Guards. In 1790, Edward arrived back in England without permission, and his father immediately sent him to serve in the 7th Regiment of Foot in Gibraltar. While in Geneva, Switzerland, Edward met Julie de Montgenet de Saint-Laurent, who was his mistress from 1790 until 1818. After Edward got married in 1818, Julie moved to Paris. There was no evidence of any children born from this relationship, but several families in Canada came descent from Edward and Julie. In 1791, Edward was transferred to an army position in Canada, and Julie accompanied him. The couple were popular in Canadian society, and they remained there until 1798, when Edward was allowed to return to England. In 1802, Edward was appointed Governor-General of Gibraltar. He was harsh to the army forces, and this led to serious consequences. On Christmas Day, he refused to allow the army garrison to celebrate with alcohol, and it led to bloodshed after the soldiers became mutinous. Edward was recalled to England, but retained the title of Governor-General of Gibraltar for the rest of his life. Edward was promoted to the rank of Field Marshal and was appointed Ranger of Hampton Court Park. Following the death of his only legitimate niece, Princess Charlotte of Wales in 1817, the rest of George III's unmarried sons sought out marriages. George III's daughters were too old by this point to possibly produce a child, and several of his sons were already in childless marriages. Only Prince William, Prince Edward and Prince Adolphus were unwed, and all three got married in 1818. Edward broke off his relationship with Julie and focused on his new wife, Victoria of Saxe-Coburg-Saalfeld, whom he married on the 29th of May, 1818. Upon their marriage, Edward became a stepfather to her 2 children from her first marriage. They had a second ceremony on the 13th of July, 1818 at Kew Palace. They lived the first few months of marriage in Lenigan, where Victoria's son was the sovereign prince. But once Victoria became pregnant, they moved to England, where their only child was born on the 24th of May, 1819, Victoria. Edward was proud of his infant daughter and leased Woolbrook Cottage as the family's home. In early January 1820, Edward caught a cold, and within days it worsened. He developed pneumonia, and his condition was worsened by the doctors forcing him to undergo bleeding and cupping. Eventually, he died on the 23rd of January, 1820, just 6 days before the king died. He left very little to his wife and daughter, only debts, which his daughter paid off once she became queen.